There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, the quiet hum of a refrigerator, the shared space on a worn-out sofa. You don't recognize them as watershed events at the time. There is no thunderclap, no orchestral score swelling in the background. There is only the moment itself, small and unassuming. And then there is the everything after, a landscape so fundamentally altered that you can barely recall the topography of what came before. For me, that moment was not a grand gesture or a dramatic confession shouted into the rain. It was a question, whispered into the dim, bluish glow of a television screen playing a movie neither of us was watching. It was a question that landed in the quiet space between us with the impossible weight of a fallen star, burning a hole through the careful, fragile reality I had spent years constructing around my own heart. We were on my couch, a familiar geography. Liam was stretched out, his head resting on the armrest at the far end, his long legs bracketing the coffee table. I was curled into the corner, a throw blanket pulled up to my chin, creating a soft fortress around myself. For months, our evenings had ended like this, in a shared silence that felt both comfortable and charged, a low-voltage current humming just beneath the surface of our friendship. He was a constant presence in my apartment, a fixed point in my orbit. He had a key. His favorite mug was in my cupboard. A spare toothbrush, still in its packaging, sat in my medicine cabinet, a silent testament to 100 nights he'd been too tired or too sad to drive back to his own empty place across town. It was a routine born of his own crisis, and I had become its willing, silent custodian. I guarded this new, fragile intimacy with the focus of a watchmaker, terrified that one wrong move, one misplaced word, one hopeful glance held a second too long, would shatter the delicate mechanism of it all. The movie droned on, something about spies in a European city. I could feel the warmth of his body from 6 feet away, a low, constant heat that my skin seemed to have memorized. I was acutely aware of the rhythm of his breathing, the way his chest rose and fell beneath his gray university sweatshirt. I had been documenting these small, mundane details for years, first through the lens of my camera, and now through the unfiltered, hyper-aware lens of my own yearning. He shifted, the old leather of the couch groaning in protest. I felt my entire body tense, a ridiculous, involuntary reaction. He was just moving. But in the quiet world we had built, every movement was a word, every gesture a sentence I would spend hours trying to translate. He cleared his throat. The sound was small, but in the stillness of the room, it was a disturbance, a pebble dropped into a perfectly still pond. Julian. His voice was different, softer, rough around the edges, as if it had been scraped raw. I didn't look at him, keeping my eyes fixed on the meaningless flicker of the screen. Looking at him felt too dangerous, too revealing. Yeah. My own voice was steady, a carefully practiced neutrality. Another long silence stretched between us. I could feel his gaze on me now. It was a physical pressure against the side of my face. I could feel the question forming in the space between us before he even spoke it, a change in the atmospheric pressure of the room. I held my breath. "Have you ever," he started, then stopped. He sighed, a sound heavy with something I couldn't name. It wasn't just tiredness. It was a deeper exhaustion, a weariness of the soul. "Never mind. It's stupid." "It's not stupid," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. It was a reflex, this need to validate him, to make a safe space for whatever thoughts were haunting him. "You can ask me anything, Liam. You know that." He was quiet for so long I thought he'd let it go, that the moment would pass and dissolve back into the comfortable quiet we knew. I was both relieved and devastated. But then, he spoke again, his voice barely audible, a ghost of a sound. "Have you ever been with a virgin?" The question didn't register at first. It was a string of nonsensical words. It was a line from a different movie, a different life. My brain tried to parse it, to fit it into the context of our friendship, of him, Liam, the golden boy, the star swimmer, the one who'd had a girlfriend since he was 16. The question made no sense. It was a syntax error in the code of our relationship. I finally turned my head, my fortress of blankets falling away. He was looking at the ceiling, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He wouldn't look at me. The vulnerability in his profile, in the deliberate avoidance of my eyes, was staggering. It was the posture of a man bracing for impact. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I thought of a dozen deflections, a dozen jokes I could make to shatter the tension and retreat to safe ground. But one look at the rigid line of his body, the sheer terror radiating from him, and I knew that this was not a moment for armor. This was a moment for truth. Once, I said, my voice as quiet as his. A long time ago, in college, the silence that followed was different. It was heavier, filled with the weight of my admission and his unspoken thoughts. I watched the slow rise and fall of his chest. One breath, two, three. He was processing. He was calculating. He was standing at the edge of a cliff, and I had just told him I knew the way down. Then, he finally turned his head. His eyes, usually so bright and clear, were dark and clouded with a terrifying, beautiful honesty. They were wide with fear, with pleading. He didn't move from his end of the couch. He didn't reach for me. He just held my gaze, and the entire world narrowed to the space between us. And then he said it, the words that would become the cornerstone of everything that came after. His voice was a thread, a fragile thing that threatened to snap. Would you be gentle? It wasn't a proposition. It wasn't a seduction. It was a surrender. It was the bravest, most terrifying thing I had ever heard. It was him, taking all of his broken pieces, all of his confusion and fear and loneliness, and laying them at my feet. It was a plea for safety, a plea for tenderness in a world that had been anything but. And in that moment, all the years of silent observation, of secret longing, of carefully guarded friendship, coalesced into a single, overwhelming certainty. He was asking me to see him, all of him, and I knew, with a clarity that was both painful and profound, that I already did. I always had. To understand the sheer seismic power of that question, you have to understand the foundation it was built upon. You have to understand the geography of our friendship, the borders and territories we had silently agreed upon for nearly a decade. Liam and I were a study in contrasts, an unlikely pairing that made sense only to us. We met in my sophomore year of college. He was a freshman, a highly recruited swimmer with a scholarship and a smile that seemed to generate its own light. He moved through the world with an easy, unthinking confidence, a physical grace that drew people to him like moths. He was all bright surfaces, loud laughter, and boundless energy. I was not. I was quiet. I was an observer by nature and, by then, by trade. I was a photography major, and my chosen subject for a semester-long documentary project was the swim team. I spent months on the periphery of their world, a ghost in the humid, chlorinated air of the natatorium. I learned the rhythms of their life, the pre-dawn practices, the punishing weight sessions, the endless laps that turned the water into a churning chaos. They were a pack, a unit of muscle and ambition, and Liam was their undisputed leader. Not because he was the fastest, though he was, but because he had a charisma that was both effortless and overwhelming. The other swimmers orbited him, fed off his energy. I watched him from behind my lens, capturing the public version of him, the fierce competitor, the encouraging teammate, the charming golden boy. My camera gave me a reason to be there, a shield to hide behind. It allowed me to look, really look, without having to explain why. For weeks, he barely noticed me. I was just part of the background, another fixture of the pool deck like the starting blocks or the lane lines. Then one afternoon, during a lull in practice, I was trying to capture the way the low winter light slanted through the high windows, turning the water's surface into a sheet of shattered diamonds. I was so lost in the frame, in the delicate interplay of light and water, that I didn't hear him approach. "What do you see in there?" His voice, so close to my ear, made me jump. I lowered the camera, my heart hammering. He was standing beside me, water dripping from his hair onto the tiled floor, a small towel slung around his neck. He wasn't looking at me, but at the pool, his head tilted in the same direction my lens had been pointing. I fumbled for words. The light, the way it hits the water. It's different today. He was quiet for a moment, just watching the pool. I expected him to laugh or make a joke and walk away. That's what most of the other guys would have done. But Liam just nodded slowly. "It looks sharp," he said, as if tasting the word. "Like it's cutting the water." I never noticed that. He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes weren't just looking at my face, they were looking at me. It was the first time I felt truly seen by him, not as a piece of equipment or a weird art student, but as a person. You see things people miss, don't you? That was the beginning. It was a small crack in the wall between our worlds, and through it, a friendship began to grow. It started with him asking to see my photos. He'd come find me in the library, where I practically lived, and I'd show him the contact sheets. He was fascinated. He didn't just look at the pictures of himself. He looked at the abstract shots of the water, the portraits of his teammates in moments of exhaustion or quiet contemplation. He saw what I was trying to do. He understood that I wasn't just documenting a sport. I was trying to capture a feeling, a state of being. Our friendship solidified over things that had nothing to do with swimming or photography. We discovered a shared love for old, terrible sci-fi movies. We bonded over a mutual hatred for our shared statistics professor. He would drag me out of the darkroom and force me to eat a real meal. I would help him edit his history papers, translating his sprawling, energetic thoughts into something coherent on the page. He was the only person who could make me laugh so hard I couldn't breathe. I was the only person he would call when the pressure of being Liam, the star, became too much. I became his anchor, his quiet harbor in the constant storm of his life. And, of course, I fell in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic fall. It was a slow erosion, a gradual sinking. It happened in 100 small moments. The way he'd throw his arm around my shoulders in a casual, thoughtless embrace that would send a jolt through my entire system. The time he fell asleep on my floor while we were studying for finals, his face so peaceful and unguarded in the lamplight. The way he always remembered my coffee order. It was a quiet, hopeless, and deeply private ache. He had a girlfriend, Amelia, a bright, kind girl from the soccer team. They were a perfect couple, two matching pieces of a golden puzzle. I liked her. I truly did, which only made the knot of guilt and longing in my stomach twist tighter. I resigned myself to my role. I was the best friend, the confidant, the platonic, safe harbor. I built walls around my heart, thick and high, and from the ramparts, I watched his life unfold. I photographed his victories in the pool. I attended his graduation party. I helped him and Amelia move into their first apartment after college. I framed a photo for them as a housewarming gift, a shot of the two of them laughing, backlit by the sun. It was a beautiful picture. It was a form of self-torture. I became an expert at living in the space between. The space between what I felt and what I could say. The space between his hand on my back and the meaning I wished it had. It was a lonely place, but it was a familiar one. It was safe. The most important thing was preserving the friendship, this miraculous, unlikely thing we had built. I would have done anything to protect it. I would have swallowed my own heart if it meant I could keep him in my life. I convinced myself that this was enough. That being his quiet observer was a privilege. That the ache was a small price to pay for his presence. For years, this was the truth I lived by. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless. The tectonic plates of our lives began to shift almost imperceptibly at first. The catalyst wasn't a sudden earthquake, but a slow, grinding pressure that built over months. It was the erosion of Liam and Amelia's relationship. From my vantage point, I had a clearer view than most. I saw the small fissures appear long before they became gaping cracks. It started with a change in the cadence of their arguments. They'd always bickered, a playful, low-stakes sparring that usually ended in laughter. But the tone changed. It became brittle, sharp. The laughter disappeared, replaced by long, tense silences that would hang in the air of their apartment whenever I was over, a toxic, invisible fog. Liam, who had always processed his world externally, through action and conversation, began to turn inward. He grew quiet. The light in him, that brilliant, effortless incandescence, seemed to dim. He was working a demanding job as a consultant now, long hours and high pressure, and the strain began to show in the hollows under his eyes and the permanent set of his jaw. He stopped talking about Amelia. He'd deflect my gentle questions with a vague, "She's fine," or "We're just tired." I didn't push. My role had always been to be the quiet space, the place he could come to when he was ready. So I waited. The breakup, when it finally happened, was quiet and devastatingly civil. There was no dramatic fight, no slammed doors. According to Liam, they sat at their kitchen table, the table I had helped them assemble, and calmly, tearfully, dismantled their shared life. They had simply grown in different directions. The future they had once planned together now looked like two diverging paths leading to landscapes the other couldn't inhabit. Amelia wanted to move back to the West Coast, to be closer to her family, to go to grad school. Liam's career was rooted here. It was a practical, heartbreaking impasse. He called me the night she moved out. His voice was hollow, an echo in a vast, empty space. "She's gone," was all he said. I didn't ask if he was okay. It was a stupid question. Instead, I said, "I'm coming over." I found him sitting on the floor of his living room, surrounded by boxes he hadn't had the heart to unpack. The apartment felt cavernous, stripped of her presence. The walls were bare where their pictures used to hang. An indentation remained on the carpet where her favorite armchair had been. It was a space haunted by the ghosts of a shared life. He didn't say anything when I walked in. He just looked up at me, his eyes looking like two dark holes in his pale face. I sat on the floor across from him, and we just stayed there, in the silence, for what must have been an hour. The silence was the only language that could hold the magnitude of his loss. That night was the beginning of the shift. He was adrift, a ship cut loose from its mooring. His friends, our mutual friends, tried to help. They took him out for drinks, tried to set him up on dates, offered the usual platitudes. But he recoiled from it. Their well-intentioned noise was a grating frequency against his raw grief. He needed quiet. He needed stillness. He needed a place where he didn't have to perform, where he didn't have to pretend to be getting over it. He needed my apartment. He started showing up unannounced. I'd be in my darkroom, the soft red light a cocoon around me, and I'd hear his key in the lock. He wouldn't call my name. He would just come in, shed his shoes by the door, and gravitate to the couch. I'd find him there when I emerged, sometimes an hour later, staring into space. He wasn't looking for conversation. He was looking for presence. My presence had become a form of medication. The lines of our friendship, once so clearly delineated, began to blur. The border I had so carefully patrolled was being breached, not by force, but by a slow, desperate seepage. He was bringing his pain into my space, and I was letting him. I was absorbing it. It was a new, terrifying, and profound intimacy. He was no longer just the friend I harbored a secret love for. He was a man I was actively tending to, whose wounds I was watching, whose quiet unraveling was happening on my couch, in my home. The unknowing initiator, driven by a need he couldn't articulate, had begun to cross into my territory, and I, the quiet observer, found myself utterly incapable of turning him away. The foundation of our old world was crumbling, and I had no idea what would be built in its place. The ritual began subtly, as most profound changes do. It started with him falling asleep on my couch. We'd be watching a movie, or I'd be working on my laptop while he read a book, and I'd look over to find his head slumped at an uncomfortable angle, his breathing deep and even. The first few times, I'd gently wake him. "Hey, man, you should probably go home and get in a real bed." He'd startle awake, disoriented and apologetic, and stumble out into the night. But the exhaustion was a tide that kept pulling him under. He was swimming against a current of grief and stress, and my couch was the only piece of solid ground he could find. One night, he looked particularly wrecked. Dark circles under his eyes seemed bruised onto his skin. He'd barely spoken 2 words since he arrived. He fell asleep halfway through the first episode of a show we were starting. When the credits rolled, I looked at him, at the tension still present in his shoulders even in sleep, and I couldn't bring myself to wake him. I couldn't send him back to that hollow, ghost-filled apartment. I grabbed the spare blanket from the linen closet and draped it over him. I turned off the lights and went to my own room, leaving him there. My heart was a frantic, panicked bird in my chest. It felt like a monumental transgression, this act of letting him stay. I was rewriting the rules of our friendship in real time, and I was terrified. The next morning, he was mortified. "Julian, I am so sorry. I can't believe I crashed here," but beneath the embarrassment, I saw a flicker of something else, relief. He looked more rested than I'd seen him in months. "It's fine, Liam," I said, handing him a mug of coffee. "Seriously, it's not a big deal. You needed the sleep." It became the new normal. Movie nights would end with him asleep on the couch. It was our unspoken arrangement. It had a comforting, plausible deniability. He was just tired. I was just being a good friend. But we both knew it was more than that. It was a need. His need for a safe harbor, and my need, a deeper, more dangerous one, to provide it. Then, the geography of our arrangement shifted. One brutally cold winter night, After a week of punishing hours at his firm, he was a ghost of himself. He was shivering, even under the blanket. "God, I'm so cold," he mumbled, his teeth chattering slightly. The words left my mouth before I had time to vet them, to analyze their potential consequences. "You can take the spare room if you want. There's a rail bed in there. And a heater." He looked at me, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The couch was one thing. A bedroom was another. It was a different level of intimacy, a more deliberate act of staying. But the exhaustion won. "Yeah," he asked, his voice small. "You sure?" "Of course," I said, my voice betraying none of the chaos churning inside me. "The bed's made. Go." He disappeared down the short hallway, and a few minutes later, I heard the soft click of the spare room door closing. That click was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a boundary being redrawn. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my own bed, in my own room, hyper-aware of his presence just one wall away. The knowledge of him sleeping under my roof, in a bed I had made, was an electric current running through the floorboards, up the frame of my bed, and into my own bones. The spare room became his. He never officially moved in, but slowly, his things began to accumulate there. A change of clothes in the closet, a book on the nightstand, his scent, a mix of clean laundry and the faint, lingering smell of chlorine that never seemed to fully leave him, began to permeate the space. He still maintained the pretext. "Just crashing for a few nights. Work is crazy," he'd say, but we both knew it was a fiction we were co-authoring. The next escalation of the ritual was the door. The first few times he used the spare room, he closed the door completely. That soft click was a definitive statement. "This is my space, that is yours." But then, one night, he left it open a crack. Just an inch. It was a sliver of darkness in the faint light of the hallway. I saw it as I walked past to my own room, and I froze. My mind, my relentless, analytical mind, went into overdrive. Was it an accident? A mistake? Or was it an invitation? A signal? It was an act of profound ambiguity, and it drove me insane. I lay in my bed, staring at my own closed door, imagining that sliver of open space down the hall. It was a question mark hanging in the architecture of my apartment. The next night, the door was ajar again. And the next, it became part of the ritual. It was a quiet acknowledgement of my presence, a lowering of a barrier. He was no longer sealing himself off. He was leaving a way in, or a way out. The final wall crumbled on a Tuesday night in February. There was a miserable, freezing rain slicking the streets. He'd shown up looking like a drowned rat, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He'd had a terrible day at work, lost a major client. He didn't want to talk about it. He just wanted to be. He showered, borrowed a pair of my sweatpants, and we settled into our usual quiet orbit. He went to his room early, and I heard the door close, but not click. A few hours later, I was in bed, reading, unable to quiet my mind. I heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. I went completely still, my eyes locked on my closed door. Another creak, closer this time. My heart rate tripled. Then, a soft knock, so tentative I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Julian." His voice was a muffled whisper through the wood. I couldn't find my own voice for a moment. I cleared my throat. "Yeah." The doorknob turned slowly. The door opened a few inches. He was standing there, a silhouette in the dim hallway light. He was holding his pillow, clutching it to his chest like a shield. He looked impossibly young and lost. "Can't sleep," he whispered. "Bad dream." It was the pretext, the plausible deniability. But his eyes, wide and dark in the shadows, told a different story. They were pleading. This wasn't about a bad dream. This was about the gaping emptiness of that other room, that other bed. This was about not wanting to be alone. Every rational thought in my head screamed at me to say no, to protect myself, to point him back to the spare room, to maintain the last, most sacred boundary. But the sight of him standing there, so vulnerable, so broken, obliterated all of my self-preservation. I didn't say anything. I just shifted over to one side of my queen-sized bed and pulled back the comforter. It was an invitation. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then slipped into the room, closing the door softly behind him. He circled around to the other side of the bed and slid under the covers. The mattress dipped with his weight. He lay on his back, ramrod straight, on the very edge of the mattress, as far away from me as he could possibly get. A vast, cold ocean of sheet and blanket stretched between us. We were two people on opposite shores of the same small island. Thanks, he mumbled to the ceiling. It's okay, I whispered back to the darkness. And so the final ritual began. A few nights a week, he would appear in my doorway, pillow in hand, with a whispered excuse. And I would let him in. We'd lie there in the dark, separated by that chasm of unspoken things. But slowly, imperceptibly, the tide began to come in. The ocean between us began to shrink. One night, his foot brushed against mine, a fleeting, electric shock. He didn't pull away. Another night, he turned over in his sleep, and the warm, solid wall of his back was pressed against mine. I lay awake for hours, barely breathing, memorizing the feeling of it. Then came the first time he reached for me. I was drifting in that space between wakefulness and sleep when I felt a weight settle over my waist. I froze, my eyes snapping open in the dark. It was his arm. He had thrown it over me in his sleep, his hand resting on my hip. His breathing was deep and even against the back of my neck. He was completely unconscious. My mind knew it was an accident, a random movement in a dream. But my body, my heart, didn't care. It was the culmination of a decade of longing, a ghost of a touch made real. I lay there, pinned by the gentle weight of his arm, in a state of exquisite torture and perfect peace. When the sun began to filter through the blinds, he stirred, his arm tightening for a second before he pulled it back, still asleep. The accidental touch became less accidental. He would shift closer in the night, his body seeking mine, a subconscious magnetism we both refused to acknowledge in the light of day. He would drape a leg over mine, or tuck his face into the space between my shoulder blades. We never spoke of it. In the morning, we would wake up on our separate sides of the bed, the chasm restored, as if a silent agreement was made in the night to erase the evidence. But the memory of it lingered on my skin all day. The ritual was a slow, agonizing, beautiful process of developing a photograph in a darkroom. The image was slowly emerging from the chemical bath, becoming clearer, more defined. And I was terrified that any sudden movement, any exposure to the harsh light of a direct question, would burn the image to white, leaving me with nothing but a blank sheet and the ghost of what might have been. The tension was becoming unbearable, a string pulled so taut it had to either resonate with a new kind of music or snap completely. The night of the crossing was heavy with a silence that was different from our usual quiet. It wasn't comfortable. It was thick with unspoken grief and a raw, palpable sadness that seemed to cling to Liam like a second skin. He'd found out through a mutual friend's social media post that Amelia was seeing someone new. It wasn't a surprise. It had been almost a year since their breakup, but the digital proof, a smiling, sun-drenched photo of her with a new man, had been a gut punch. He didn't tell me that's what was wrong. He didn't have to. I knew. I saw it in the way he stared at his phone, his thumb frozen over the screen. I saw it in the unnatural stillness of his body when he finally put the phone down, face first, on the coffee table. He didn't want a movie. He didn't want to talk. He just sat on my couch, a hollowed-out version of himself, until the sky outside my window was a deep, starless indigo. "I think I'm going to turn in," he said, his voice flat. He didn't even go to his designated spare room first. He just stood up, walked down the hall, and disappeared into my bedroom. I followed a few minutes later, my heart aching for him. He was already in bed, on his side, facing the wall. I slid in behind him, the usual chasm between us feeling more like a desolate, unbridgeable canyon tonight. The air was cold with his misery. For hours, we lay there, two separate islands of silence in the dark. I could tell he wasn't sleeping. The tension in his back was a solid wall of muscle. I wanted to reach out, to put a hand on his shoulder, to offer some physical comfort. But I was paralyzed. The rules of our ritual were so specific, so fragile. I was the receiver, the passive harbor. He had to be the one to initiate, to cross the space. To do so myself felt like a violation, a presumption I couldn't risk. So I just lay there, breathing in time with him, sending silent, useless waves of comfort across the empty sheets. Sometime after 2 in the morning, he shifted, rolling onto his back. He stared at the ceiling, a pale, anonymous plane in the gloom. I stayed on my side, pretending to be asleep, watching him through my eyelashes. The moonlight, filtered through the blinds, cast stripes across the bed, across his body. He looked like a prisoner in a cage of his own making. Then came the question. That first, baffling question. Have you ever been with a virgin? It landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. My breath hitched. My carefully constructed pretense of sleep evaporated. Every nerve ending in my body was suddenly on high alert. This was not part of the ritual. This was a deviation from the script. This was new territory, a dark, uncharted landscape. I took a moment, a long, suspended moment, to let the shock subside, to force my heart out of my throat. I turned onto my back as well, so we were two soldiers lying side by side, staring up at the same dark sky. Once, I said, my voice raspy. A long time ago, in college. The silence that followed was the most profound silence I have ever experienced. It was not empty. It was filled with everything. A decade of friendship. Months of this strange, intimate cohabitation. 100 nights of unspoken longing. 1,000 questions I'd never dared to ask. I could feel him processing my answer, feel the gears turning in his head. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that whatever he said next would change everything. The taut string was about to snap or sing. He turned his head on the pillow, and his eyes found mine in the dark. They were stripped bare of all pretense. There was no confidence, no charm, no easy smile. There was only a terrifying, desperate vulnerability. He was a man on a ledge, and he was looking at me, not as a friend, not as a roommate, but as the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving around him. And then, the whisper that broke me and remade me all at once. Would you be gentle? The words were a key turning in a lock I didn't even know was there. They unlocked a chamber in my heart that had been sealed for a decade. Gentle. He was asking for gentleness. He wasn't asking for sex. He wasn't asking for passion. He was asking for care. He was admitting, in the most profound and indirect way, his own fragility. He was telling me he was broken. He was telling me he was scared. He was telling me he was a virgin in this, in whatever this was. This new country of feeling he'd stumbled into, a place where the maps of his old life were useless. My own fear, the constant, humming anxiety I had lived with for months, vanished. It was replaced by a wave of tenderness so powerful it almost brought me to tears. All the analysis, all the overthinking, all the fear of misreading the signals, it all fell away. There was no ambiguity here. This was the clearest signal I had ever received. It was a total, unconditional surrender. I didn't answer with words. Words felt clumsy, inadequate. Instead, I turned on my side to face him. I held his gaze, letting him see everything I had kept hidden for so long. The hope, the fear, the overwhelming, breathtaking love. And then, slowly, so slowly, I reached out my hand and laid it on his cheek. His skin was cool. He flinched, just for a second, a flicker of panic in his eyes, and then he leaned into my touch, a soft, shuddering sigh escaping his lips. He closed his eyes. It was a gesture of complete trust. I slid my hand from his cheek to the back of his neck, my thumb stroking the soft skin just below his hairline. I drew him closer, closing the last few inches of that vast ocean that had separated us. His forehead came to rest against mine. I could feel his breath, warm and unsteady, on my lips. We stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing each other in, our worlds shrinking to this single point of contact in the dark. Liam, I whispered, the name a prayer on my lips. He didn't answer. He just made a small sound, a note of pure, unadulterated need. And then, I kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion or hunger or pin-up desire. It was the physical embodiment of his question and my unspoken answer. It was gentle. It was tentative. It was a question. Is this okay? It was the soft press of my lips against his, a gesture of reassurance. He was still for a moment, and then his lips softened under mine, answering the question. Yes. He kissed me back, a clumsy, hesitant, beautiful kiss. It tasted of salt and fear and a desperate, dawning hope. It was the kiss of a man learning a new language. It was the kiss of a man coming home to a place he never knew he was searching for. It was the sound of the string, finally, beginning to sing. I woke to an empty bed. The indentation of his head was still on the pillow next to mine. The sheets were still warm where his body had been, but he was gone. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, replaced the soft, hopeful haze I had woken up in. I sat up, my heart starting a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. The morning light filtering through the blinds felt harsh and interrogating. The quiet of the apartment, usually a comfort, was now an accusation. I got out of bed and walked through the apartment. His shoes were gone from their place by the door. His jacket was gone from the hook. I went to the spare room. The door was wide open. The bed was neatly made, the book on the nightstand gone. It was as if he'd been methodically erasing any trace of his presence, not just from the night before, but from the past few months. A full-scale retreat. I picked up my phone from the kitchen counter. There was one new message. From him. My hand was shaking as I opened it. Hey, sorry about last night. I was in a weird headspace. Let's just forget it happened. The words were like ice water in my veins. Forget it happened. For words to dismantle a decade. For words to invalidate the most honest moment of my entire life. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in the dark of my bedroom withered and died in the stark morning light. I felt a fool. A naive, hopeful fool who had mistaken a moment of desperate, confused grief for something more. He hadn't been coming home. He had just been lost, and I was just the nearest port in a storm. And now the storm had passed, and he was sailing away, leaving me wrecked on the shore. The pain was breathtaking. It was a deep, physical ache in the center of my chest, a hollow space where all that hope had been. He avoided me for the next 3 days. My texts went unanswered. My calls went straight to voicemail. The silence was a crushing weight. I oscillated wildly between a white-hot anger and a deep, bottomless despair. I was furious at him for his cowardice, for his casual cruelty. He didn't get to do that. He didn't get to crack open my entire world, peer inside, and then walk away as if he'd seen nothing of value. But underneath the anger was the devastating fear that I had been wrong about everything, that I had projected my own feelings onto his actions, that I had built a cathedral of meaning out of a pile of random stones. The quiet observer had made a fatal error in interpretation. By the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The anger finally won out over the despair. This couldn't end in a text message and a ghosting. Our friendship, even if that's all it ever was, deserved more than that. It deserved a conversation. It deserved the dignity of an ending, if that's what this was. I needed to look him in the eye. I needed to hear it from his mouth. I knew his schedule. I knew he had swim practice at the university pool from 6 to 8 every evening, a habit he'd kept up since college to de-stress from work. I drove there, my stomach in knots, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I walked into the familiar, humid natatorium. The smell of chlorine was a punch of nostalgia. He was just finishing his last set of laps. I watched him pull himself out of the water, sleek and powerful, his body glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. He ran a hand through his wet hair, oblivious to my presence. I waited for him by the locker room entrance. When he came out, dressed in jeans and a hoodie, his hair still damp, he saw me and froze. The color drained from his face. He looked like a cornered animal. "Julian," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said. My voice was quiet, but it was steady. It held a firmness that surprised even me. The passive observer was gone. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said, refusing to meet my eyes, starting to walk past me. I moved, blocking his path. "No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to send a text message and disappear." "Look, I said I was sorry," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on a point over my shoulder. "It was a mistake. I was messed up about Amelia. I wasn't thinking straight." "Was it a mistake when you started sleeping on my couch?" I asked, my voice still quiet, but cutting. "Was it a mistake when you started staying in the spare room? When you started leaving the door open? Was it a mistake every single night for 2 months when you came into my bed because you couldn't sleep alone?" He flinched at every question, as if each one was a physical blow. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, panicked confusion. "I don't know," he choked out. "I don't know what that was." "Then what about the question?" I pressed, my voice breaking slightly despite my best efforts. "What about would you be gentle?" "People don't ask that by mistake, Liam. People don't say that when they're just messed up, that was real. You were there, and I was there, and it was the realest thing that has ever happened to me. And you do not get to call it a mistake and ask me to forget it." Tears were welling in his eyes. He scrubbed at them angrily with the back of his hand. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't. I'm not." He couldn't even say the words. He couldn't articulate the identity he was so terrified of losing, or the new one he was terrified of claiming. "I'm not asking you to be anything," I said, and my anger was dissolving, replaced by that same, overwhelming tenderness from the other night. I saw him not as a coward, but as a man who was profoundly, deeply scared. "I'm not asking for a label or a parade. I'm just asking for honesty. For you to not treat me, and whatever that was, like it was nothing. Because it wasn't nothing to me. And I don't think it was nothing to you, either." He finally broke. A choked sob escaped him, and he leaned his forehead against the cold tile of the wall, his shoulders shaking. "I'm so scared," he whispered to the wall. "I've spent my whole life being one person. I know how to be that person. I don't know how to be this. I don't know how to want this." He turned his head, his cheek pressed against the tiles, and looked at me, his face a mess of tears and confusion. "It's just, with you it's quiet. It's safe. I haven't felt safe in so long. And that night, it just felt like the only right thing in the entire world. And that scared me more than anything. It was a confession, a real one. Not of love, not of identity, but of feeling. A confession of his own deep, internal conflict. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting a part of himself he didn't understand and was terrified by. The aftermath was not an ending. It was a painful, necessary conflict. And for the first time in days, a tiny, fragile sliver of hope pushed its way through the wreckage. The story wasn't over. We were just in the most difficult chapter. We didn't go back to my apartment. We didn't go back to his. We just stood in that echoey, sterile hallway of the natatorium for what felt like hours, and we talked. Or rather, he talked, and I listened. The dam of his confusion and fear finally broke, and everything came pouring out in a torrent of whispered, broken sentences. He talked about the pressure he'd always felt to be the golden boy, the straight, confident athlete. He talked about how his relationship with Amelia had felt like the right path, the pre-approved script for his life, and how lost he'd been since that script had been torn up. He confessed that the comfort he found with me was different from any comfort he'd ever known. It wasn't loud or distracting. It was a deep, resonant quiet that calmed the chaos inside him. "I didn't know what it was," he said, his voice raw. "I just knew I needed it. I needed you. You're quiet. And I didn't want to put a name on it because I was afraid the name would break it. Or break me." He finally looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed but clear for the first time. "When I woke up that morning, in your bed, with your arm around me, it felt right. Terrifyingly right. And I panicked. I ran. Because it felt like if I stayed, I would have to become someone I didn't know how to be." I listened to all of it, my own pain and anger dissolving with every word he spoke. This wasn't about me, not really. This was his own internal war. I had just been the battlefield. And now, he was finally surveying the damage. "You don't have to become anyone," I said softly when he finally fell silent. "You just have to be honest. With yourself, and with me. We don't have to put a name on it, Liam. We don't have to know what it is tomorrow or next week. We just have to not run away from it today." He nodded, a slow, tired movement. "I'm sorry, Julian," he said, and the apology was so profound, so heavy with the weight of the hurt he'd caused. "I was a coward. I hurt you, and you were the only person who was being gentle with me." That word, gentle. It hung in the air between us again, but this time it wasn't a question. It was a recognition, a truth we had both experienced. We drove back to my apartment in separate cars, a silent, necessary buffer of space. When he walked through my door, it was different. There was no pretext. He wasn't a friend crashing. He was there with an intention, even if that intention was simply to not run away. That night, the ritual was reborn, but it was changed. It was deliberate. When it was time for bed, he didn't go to the spare room. He just looked at me, a question in his eyes. I nodded and walked to my bedroom, and he followed. He didn't bring his pillow as a prop. He slid into the bed, and this time, there was no chasm. He turned on his side to face me, and I faced him. In the quiet dark, he reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. It was a simple, solid gesture. An anchor. "Can we just start here?" he whispered. "This is a good place to start," I whispered back. And that's what we did. We started there, in the quiet, in the dark, holding hands. The new normal was built not on grand declarations, but on a series of small, intentional acts of honesty. The cuddling was no longer accidental. It was a conscious seeking of comfort and closeness. The kisses were no longer hesitant questions. They were quiet affirmations, soft and sure in the morning light before work, or late at night when words felt inadequate. We talked more. We learned to navigate his fear and my years of guardedness. It was a slow, careful process, like two people learning to walk again after a long illness. The symbols of our old, ambiguous life transformed. The spare room, once his sad refuge, was slowly packed up. His things migrated, piece by piece, into my room. A stack of his books on my nightstand. His ridiculously large collection of hoodies in my closet. His key was no longer for emergencies. It was for coming home. The sound of it in the lock no longer sent a jolt of anxiety through me, but a wave of profound, settled peace. One afternoon, a few months later, I was in my darkroom, the red light casting its familiar, monastic glow. I was developing a new set of photos, images of water, of light, of abstract patterns. The door creaked open, and Liam slipped in, closing it behind him. He didn't say anything. He just came and stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. We stood there in silence, watching as an image slowly, magically appeared on the paper submerged in the chemical bath. It was a shot I had taken of him weeks ago, asleep in our bed, the morning light tracing the curve of his spine. He was the picture, emerging from the dark, beautiful and clear and real. He tightened his arms around me. "I see what you mean," he murmured into my ear, his voice warm. "About the light. It's different now. It's not sharp. It's soft." We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The most profound changes, I've learned, don't announce themselves with thunder. They don't arrive with drama and fanfare. They arrive in a whisper in the dead of night. They come disguised as a quiet question, a plea for tenderness. They begin not with a bang, but with the simple, courageous act of turning to the person next to you in the dark and asking them, trusting them, to be gentle. And the life that grows from that moment is quieter, softer, and more real than anything you could have ever imagined before. It is a photograph slowly developing, a truth emerging, a peace that, once found, you would never, ever let go.